So if you're a working professional, a student, somebody in academia, a creative, anyone who produces any kind of work product, and anyone who is an IC or an individual contributor, meaning that your job involves you doing work and then reporting to some kind of manager who manages other people, then this is going to be really relevant to you because you've probably run into a situation before where you're working on a piece of work or a piece of art, or you're doing a project, you're writing a research paper, for example, what have you, and you feel like it's not ready to be presented to the final judge, whether it's your boss or some VP that you're presenting to, or it's a professor or whatever. You feel as though the work, even though you've put hundreds and hundreds of hours, maybe days, months, years into this work, you feel like it's still not good enough. And what do we call that? Well, most people would know the answer, and that is perfectionism. It is your perfectionism that is influencing you and making you feel as though the work that you've produced is not good enough, and that it won't be good enough until it is perfect. Now, I think most people understand the concept of perfectionism, but what they might not think about is its relationship to this word right here, productivity. Now, what does perfectionism and productivity have to do with each other? Well, they're actually in some ways opposites, because perfectionism by nature means that you're spending a lot of time perfecting one single thing, whereas productivity basically means you're producing many, many things, oftentimes as much as possible. And so anyone who has a job or has worked on any big project before will know what it feels like when you try to balance your perfectionism bias versus your need to be productive at work, right? Because we can't spend all day or all year on working on only one thing. And so a helpful way that I like to visualize perfectionism versus productivity is in the shape of a graph like this, where you might have something like perfectionism on the x-axis, and you might have productivity on the y-axis. Now, the shape of the graph and the curve under which 99% of people would fall under looks something like this, where if you're someone who is extremely perfectionist, then that means you're probably agonizing over the details and the theory of one very specific thing, and you're working on it and you don't want to send it out into the world to be judged by others until it's absolutely perfect. And so you would be somewhere right here. And on the other hand, you might have someone on the other end of the spectrum where they're extremely productive, but they're not perfectionist whatsoever. And so this person is producing hundreds, if not thousands of output, and they're extremely efficient at it. But the problem is, because they have very low standards, the work product isn't very good. And so they'd sit right here. Now, you're probably seeing where I'm going with this, but essentially where most people, if you work a normal job where you have deadlines and you don't have all day to work on one thing and you just have expectations and your manager needs you to work on more than just one thing, you probably need to balance being perfectionist and productivity because you still want to produce high quality work, but you need to do it in a timely manner. And that's 90% of people. And so you want to be somewhere right here in the middle. And so to recap, the person over here is obsessed with being absolutely perfect and producing the perfect thing. And so this is what we would actually call a bitter, self-proclaimed genius. And on the other hand, the person over here, well, unfortunately, they're just producing a pile of crap. And so you don't want to really be at either ends of these extremes. You want to be right here with a nice balance of quality and quantity, which is the sweet spot. But this begs the question, how do we get to the sweet spot? Because most people probably fall on one end of the spectrum or another. You're probably more on the side of perfectionism, and so you struggle to take action, or you might be on the side of productivity, and so you take too much action sometimes, which may not necessarily be a bad thing, but maybe it means that the work that you're producing isn't as good as you would want it to be. But let's talk about the person that maybe falls somewhere closer to the perfectionism side of the spectrum, because I think most people nowadays, especially if you're a ambitious, high-achieving individual, and if you're watching my channel, then it probably means that you enjoy achieving your goals, you are motivated, and you want to make the most out of your life. And so most people, if you're like that, you probably have some inkling of perfectionism drilled into your mind where you don't want to look stupid, or you don't want to produce work that you don't think is up to your standards, or you don't want to be judged by people for things that don't accurately reflect how you want to be perceived. And so you probably think of yourself as having high standards, but today I'm going to argue about why you should actually lower your standards if you want to achieve your next goal. And so I want to start with this quote by Salvador Dali, where he says, "Have no fear of perfection. You'll never reach it." Sorry, there's a loud siren outside. I don't know if you can hear it. And so what does he mean by this quote? Well, Salvador Dali, who was an artist, would really understand this whole dynamic between perfectionism and productivity. Because especially when you're an artist, you tend to move towards this end of the spectrum. And you tend to agonize over every single detail in your portrait or your painting or whatever you're producing. And it can be very hard to declare a work of art finished or ready to show the world. At the same time, though, it's ironic that we strive so hard for perfection because we'll never reach it. Because perfection is like the limit that doesn't exist, where you can strive harder and harder for it, and you can get closer and closer, but you never will reach it. And so at a certain point, even the most perfectionist people have to decide, okay, I'm done. There is no more that I can possibly do. And while it's definitely good to have high standards, and I don't want to go out here and say that you should just completely remove all standards in your life. I think standards are important, and they protect us in some ways from a life that we don't want. But for a lot of people, you'd be surprised at just how much more you can achieve and accomplish if you just lower your standards by a little bit. What do I mean by that? Well, for a lot of people, your inaction is actually not a result of your inability to do something, or that you lack the time or whatever. It's actually because of a fear. Now, a fear of what? Well, it's a fear of other people judging you and seeing you in a less than favorable way. And so your high standards are an excuse to do nothing, right? Like, think about how many people we know who always make excuses as to why they don't want to do something, even though they know that they should. Or let's say that someone has some insane goal that they set for themselves, but they refuse to take the first step towards doing it. Why is that? Well, in large part, it's because their high standards are actually feeding this perfectionism bias, which is preventing them from taking action. Because taking action often leads to mistakes, which is not what someone who is highly perfectionist wants to happen. So how do we overcome this, though? How do we overcome this excuse to do nothing? How do we overcome this feeling that, man, I don't want to start until it's absolutely perfect. Like, I don't want to film this YouTube video until I have scripted the entire thing perfectly. I don't want to go out there and play basketball until I've practiced my form and everything's perfect and I'm going to score a three-pointer. Or I don't want to go out there and do a practice case interview with my friend or my study partner because I'm not done studying all of the textbooks. I'm not done studying all of the frameworks. All of these excuses are just things that your mind is making up to stop you from accomplishing your goals. But there's one more thing I want to share with you, which is this concept of quality and quantity. Now, I think a lot of times people, especially when you're a beginner, think that in order to produce, for example, a high quality piece of work, like a high quality video, for example, you need to really understand what makes the perfect video. Or say, for example, you're taking photography lessons and you want to take the perfect photo. You probably think, okay, I need to go online and I need to learn about everything there is to know about the perfect lighting, the perfect camera settings, the perfect lenses, and then I need to go and get all that equipment, and then I need the perfect spot. I need to find the perfect timing when the sun is setting at just the right moment, the golden hour, and then I can get the perfect photo. But you're totally wrong. And in fact, there was a study that was done by a professor at, I believe, the University of Florida, who had a photography class. And in this class, he had students, two groups of students, for their final project, produce photos. Now, the first group was asked to just produce the perfect photo, and they would be graded purely on how good the photo was. But the second group would be graded on how many photos they could take and produce. And so it wasn't anything related to the quality of the photos, just the quantity. But at the end of the semester, the professor actually found that the group of students over here who had taken hundreds, if not thousands of photos, inadvertently also had better photos than the group that was asked to be graded purely on a single photo of the highest quality that they could produce. Now that might seem counterintuitive, but what you have to think about is this group over here had spent hours just theorizing about what would make the perfect photo. And they never actually went out there and got the reps in. While this group was just messing up left and right, but learning from it, and ultimately getting better and better through the hundreds of repetitions that they were able to get in. And so an important lesson from here that the professor learned is that in many cases, quantity leads to quality. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, what are you talking about, man? That can't always be the case. Otherwise, why would that guy who's posted like 1,000 pictures or 1,000 YouTube videos have only like 100 subscribers or 10 followers on Instagram, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you're producing 100 crappy photos, right? No one's going to want to look at them. But I would argue the nuance here is that in most cases, this principle applies when you're a beginner. And as you become more advanced in any practice, then it shifts towards perfectionism. Because think about this, right? When you're a beginner, you literally know nothing. And so every time you even try, you learn a lot. And just by virtue of messing up, you get more and more feedback. And so it's important as a beginner with zero knowledge to just going out there, take action, and start learning. But as you become more advanced in any discipline, then you begin to see that, for example, really, really big YouTube channels might not post as frequently because they know that quality matters. And for them, just producing another video of the same quality isn't as important as producing an extremely high quality video, even if it took a little bit more time. And so that's just one example, but I would argue that across the board, the more advanced you get at something, the more perfectionism tends to play a role. But most people aren't at the expert level of their discipline. And so most people would actually benefit from the quantity piece, where they should just be getting the reps in, especially in the beginning if you're picking up something new. And then over time, as you become more advanced, then the perfectionism starts to make more sense, because then you have all of this knowledge and you're just trying to apply it to produce the highest quality thing that you can produce. So if you take nothing else away from this video today, I want you to just remember that in most cases, if you're at work and you're working on something that your manager assigned you, and you're feeling this tension between, oh, I want to get this done in a timely manner, but it also doesn't feel good enough, then just remember this dynamic here and think about where you fall along the spectrum. If you tend to be someone who falls on the perfectionism side of things, then maybe you need to take a step back and remember that it's okay, you're never going to truly reach perfection. On the other hand, if you're someone who gets a lot of feedback about, oh, your work isn't high quality enough, but you're fast, then maybe you need to spend a little bit more time to move back towards the sweet spot.